welcome to final debate, everybody. All right, so I have a few announcements to make to you all. Number one, please be respectful of the venue. You are in a church. You are allowed to do house cheers. You're allowed to clap. You're allowed to stand. But please do not bang on the pews or leave trash or any of that stuff. Also, speaking of respect, please be respectful to the debaters on Twitter and social media. All right, so let's get started. I would like to introduce to you our judges for tonight. First, Dr. Hidgley, General Gibson, Dean Leedy, okay, Churchill, calm down. Dr. Blander, Josiah Peterson, and Dr. Kabiawu. All right, and to my left is our great government team, Kyle Kendrick, and Drew Hepler. And then in opposition is Kat Samuelson and Ann Carmen. Okay, so I'm gonna read to you guys the motion for tonight and then we'll get started. All right, this House believes that when faced with the choice between spending discretionary income on non-essentials or giving to charity, individuals should always choose to give to charity. So we'll welcome our first debaters.
Can y'all hear me if I stand over here? Okay. That's the thing with these final rounds. They change everything and it's weird. If you've watched my previous two debate rounds, you've seen two different Calvin and Hobbes openers, and you're in for a third. There's a Calvin and Hobbes where Calvin is walking through the woods with Hobbes, as he often does, and they come across a raccoon. It's a baby raccoon. It's been left by its mother, and it's about to die. And they take the raccoon in. They bring it home. He takes it to his mom. It's a really touching moment between Calvin and his parents as they work to try to resuscitate this raccoon, nurse it back to life, and set it back into the wild. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen. The life lesson for Calvin is that things don't always end well. They don't always end how he wants them to. Sometimes the cute little raccoon that you found in the woods doesn't make it, and that's sad. But the lesson for Calvin isn't that he should go out searching for all the dead little raccoons out there to try to take care of them. The lesson is that if he comes across a raccoon, it's a good thing to try to take care of it, but not that he must go searching for a bunch of injured raccoons to try to take care of. That's the position that we stand for on the government side in this round. The motion we've been asked to debate is that this House believes that when faced with the choice between spending discretionary income on non-essentials or giving it to charity, individuals should always choose to give it to charity. And the fundamental point that we're making is that while it's good to give to charity, and we should give to charity if given that particular choice, that doesn't mean that we have to go looking for those opportunities, that we must spend everything we have on charities. I'll be explaining that throughout my speech if that seems a little confusing at this point. Before I get into a couple of questions we want to answer in this round, here are a few points of motion analysis. The first point is that the people that we're talking about, the individuals we're talking about, are not people in poverty or near poverty. That is, they have additional income on top of their disposable income. They have additional income on top of being provided for their basic needs. So these aren't people who are about to starve, who are about to run out of water, who don't have shelter, and so forth. So these are people who have extra income. These are people in relative wealth. Secondly, we're talking about a particular choice. We're not talking about spending all of your discretionary income. The motion specifically says when faced with a choice. The motion doesn't say that individuals should spend all of their discretionary income on charity. It says when faced with the choice between spending on charity or spending on something non-essential, they should choose to spend on charity. And the final point of motion analysis is that charity means a particular organization. Charity is not a general thing. It's about giving to a particular organization at a particular time with a particular choice. All right, so let's get into answering a few questions. The first is, what is discretionary? What is discretionary? The first point I'd like to make here is that luxury is relative. This is a point going back to Adam Ferguson. Luxury is a relative thing. And so what's a need for somebody might not be a need for somebody else. So for example, we might be rashly about to throw out there things like, well, a car isn't a need, but for some people it is. If you live 30 minutes away from where you work, or if you have to have a car for your particular job, it is a need. It is essential. So what we're talking about, non-essentials, can vary from person to person. So there's not a particular bright line we can put on what is essential and what is non-essential. The second point I'd like to make here is that we'd like to talk about theological, not economic, discretion, because there might be particular definitions of economically discretionary income that differ from what is theologically discretionary. In other words, God has a will for people's lives, and that can differ. So some people might have things that God wants them to do that are necessary for them to do in their lives that others don't have to do. This is going back again to that particular point that it's about a particular choice being made, not about all discretionary income being spent on charity. The second question I'd like to answer is, what kinds of things help the poor? What kinds of things help the poor? Just talking in general terms here. First point I'm going to say, capitalism. Capitalism helps the poor. That's true, right? And so what we could have argued in this round is that discretionary income should be spent in the market on goods because capitalism helps poor people. I'm not sure if the opposition is going to say that, but they might. But it's true that capitalism does help poor people. It's the most effective way of lifting people out of poverty. But it's also true that capitalism isn't perfect. It's not 100% foolproof. There are other things that need to be brought in as well. And so while capitalism helps, it's not sufficient. Things like charity also are needed. Charity, at the very least, fills in the gaps that aren't provided by market forces. But there are other things that help as well. Volunteering helps the poor. Missions trips help the poor. And guess what all of these things require? Money. And guess what many of these organizations don't have? Money. People in the United States tend to give, I believe it's around 5% of their income to charities. And that's including all the Christians who are hopefully giving 10% of their income to churches, but perhaps not all of them are. But even 10% is not all that much. That's the minimum that's established in the Bible. That's not the maximum we're called to give. In fact, we're called to give a lot more than that. We're called to help the orphans and widows in their distress. The rich young ruler, while it's not a principle for everybody, he's told to give everything that he has to the poor. And so it's obvious that there's something more than just that 10%. There's something beyond just, here's some stuff, and now we're going to go and enjoy ourselves over here. So that brings me to the third point. That is, who helps the poor the most? I'll get to your question in just a minute. Who helps the poor the most? We believe that the government side helps the poor the most because people generally don't give unless there's some sort of incentive for them to do so. And so if we're saying it's a moral principle that when faced with this particular choice they ought to give, that's providing more for those charities that don't have enough money to currently do what they want to do. I'll go ahead and take your question.
So you mentioned the percentage of money that people use for income or for charities, and I was wondering if you happen to know the percentage for discretionary money and what marginal difference that would even make if they used all of it as stated in the motion.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have the particular numbers stored in my head before this round, so I can't quite answer that question. I remember some things I read, but not all of them. So the final point I'd like to make here is that we're talking about Christian principles and Torah principles. And those principles are demanding. They ask a lot of people. But let's think about what the Torah requires. It requires that the edges of the land be left bare for those in poor to take. But it doesn't require that all of the land be left for poor to take, or that all of the stuff beyond what you need for you to eat and for your family to eat be left for the poor to take. And so we believe there's a particular choice that the motion is asking us to analyze, and when faced with that particular choice, individuals ought to choose to give to charity. Thanks.
There are like 4 pins up here. I'm just gonna move them. All right. All the judges ready? Okay, can you even see me? I'm 5 feet tall, so. Okay. Okay. All right, if everybody's ready, then we'll go ahead and begin. You know, Clara Barton once said that you must never think so much as whether it is bearable or not, or whether you want to or not, but you must never think of anything but the need and how to fix it. We think that creating a culture that's okay with just throwing money at the problem as opposed to actively showing compassion to others and actively going into communities and making a difference is a world that we don't want to live in. We don't want to live in a world where people don't actively stand up for what is right and instead just say a checkbox of money means that they have completed their task for the day. We think that this encourages a passive culture, and so because of this reason, we are proud to oppose the motion. So through this speech, I'm going to show you 2 points of clarification framework, and then we're going to go into 3 main constructive argumentation. Within that, we'll have a bit of rebuttal from what we heard out of the last speaker. So the first point I want to look at is that of the framework for this debate round. We think we should view this as active versus passive compassion. What do we mean by that? We mean we want to talk about we want to look at this round through the viewpoints of which way best encourages active compassion in the world. It best encourages individuals who have, this extra money, what they should do with that, and in their action of spending it for charities or non-essentials, we think that we should be viewing which best upholds active compassion as opposed to passive compassion. The second point, we're going to clarify it, and that is the burden of the government side. I was kind of surprised to hear the Prime Minister come up and try to explain that this is only when it's come between a choice, because I think inherent in the motion is the word of a choice. It's talking about because anytime you have extra money or this discretionary income, you always have a choice. So we're talking about always choosing to give to charity as opposed to spending on non-essentials. The burden of the government side is to show you that we should always, under any circumstance, when we have extra discretionary income, we should always be using it and giving it to charity. And it's because we don't believe that this can be fully proven and provide active compassion in the world that we are proud to oppose. So next I want to move into some of the constructive argumentation. The first point we want to look at is that monetary donations are limited. Monetary donations are limited, or rather, the impact of monetary donations can be limited. Because under the government side, they're assuming that charities always have the best interest in mind, we think that that's an unfair assumption. We think that the world has corruption, and we think that there are a lot of charities, and saying giving to charity, you can just allow that to be anything. It can be giving to a charity that you haven't fully vetted and really understand what they're doing with the money you're giving them. It can be giving to a charity that has other ulterior motives that you don't know about because you're not actively going out and making a difference in the world. We think because of that, we have an assumption, and a wrongful assumption by the government team that charities always have best interest in mind. But furthermore, we think that some donations can be good, but charities also depend on volunteers. They also depend on having those people who are absolutely willing to go out and make a difference in the world and actually be active in the charity and active in making a difference. Not just spending an amount of income and writing a check and having that be your good deed for the year. We think that that's unfair, and it doesn't encourage an active culture of compassion. And this leads me to the second point of limiting non-essential spending discourages active compassion. What do we mean by this? Well, what can you use spending non-essentials on? What does that mean when you have those non-essentials? We think that that can also mean making a home a warm and inviting place so that you can invite people from the community into your home. We think that that is wrong to say you shouldn't spend any of your money on making a home a place that you can bring in orphans or bring in people of the community from your church that you need to witness to, or that you can even be willing to buy a plane ticket with your extra money to go out to a place that needs people who are willing to work and people who are willing to volunteer and make a difference in the world. Saying that under any circumstance, when you have that non-essential amount of money, when you have that money that you haven't given to another, a different cause, and you have the choice between saying whether it's going to be non-essentials or it's going to be charity. We think that saying always under any circumstance charity doesn't include spending non-essentials on bettering or allowing you to have the capacity and the ability to make a difference in the world with other people, and to actually get out there on the battlefield and be willing to make a difference in communities around the world. Why is this the case, though? We think that the government team is going to come up, and they're going to say, well, people will still volunteer, and they will still engage in ministry. That would be an ideal world. That would be a world where someone who is giving money to, when they have this money they haven't allocated in their resources yet, it's assuming that because they're giving it to charity, they also are doing that with a good heart. We think a lot of the times people are, that they actually encourage a passive culture because it allows people to view donations to charities as a checkbox of their good deed for the day. We think that saying we will always do this will allow people to feel actually less willing to make an active difference in the world, less willing to go out into the places and into where we desperately need volunteers and individuals, because they think, well, I've already spent so much of my money on giving to charity, so I'm good for the day. We think, unfortunately, that's a viewpoint a lot of people have. So by having a world where we say just throwing money at problems solve it is incredibly harmful to valuing active compassion in the real world. We think that what also happens with this is that you allow people to think of themselves with a savior complex. They think that if you don't get out there yourself and actually see the suffering of the world and actually understand what's going on and the problems in the world, and you just allow yourself to say, well, I gave money to charity, so I'm good to go, we think that that allows people to actively work as or create a mind frame of having a savior complex of saying, well, you know, I don't really see any of the issues going on, but at least I've given enough money to charity that I know that my good deed for the day is done. My money's helping people, so I'm good with it. As opposed to encouraging people to spend money on non-essentials, which could in fact mean also spending money on having a better, more warm and welcoming home, but furthermore allowing them to have a community that engages in active action in the real world, as opposed to just having this write-off to charity. So what do we think out of the entire, basically, motion that is presented to us, what the biggest problem is? We think the biggest problem is that looking at the wording specifically, it says that when you're faced with this choice, which in any case when you have discretionary income, you always have a choice. It's always going to be your choice on what you do with that money. We think that saying you would always give to charity allows people to not only encourage a mind frame of a passive culture, but even furthermore says that they will always give to charity eliminates the possibility of them using some of that money to make a difference in their own community, or allowing themselves to separate from this idea of a culture that has charities that could be corrupt and instead make an individual difference. Giving money to their church is separate from saying just giving to charity. We think because of all of these reasons, the motion does not stand at the end of this round, because clearly we have a world versus active or passive compassion. If you see a need, you must meet it, just like Clara Barton said, and you can't meet it just by writing a check.
Can everybody hear me? All right. Let's flip this back up just a bit. Okay. Before I came to the King's College, I was faced with a choice. That choice was either coming to the King's College or going in a year-long missionary intensive program because of a course called Perspectives. In this course, if you've taken it, you'll know that essentially this course is focused around the idea of global missions. And they teach you a lot about going out and serving for the sake of the gospel, and they talk a lot about unreached people groups and Bible translation and stuff like that. I was taking it with a friend of mine, and he wanted to become an engineer. and he really actually struggled with this decision about whether he should become an engineer or whether he should go join the mission field. And so on the last day, he approached the lecturer, and the lecturer told him this: yeah, that's great that you really want to go into the mission field, but wait just a second, because we need senders too. There are people who go into the mission field, but there needs to be people who send those people, who support them financially. And that's the case that we as the opposition side are making, or the government side are making in this debate, that we think charity can be just as good, because it is also, like the opposition team wants to argue, is actually an action as well. Let's take a look at some of the arguments just on the motion on top. Now, they talk a little bit about the argument about being faced with a choice. That was the second point of our analysis that Drew provided in his speech. And they talked a little bit about the government burden. They talked about how any time you have a choice is essentially the framework from which they're operating. We don't think this is a super relevant point in the debate. However, we do think that if that was the intention of the motion, then it would have said all discretionary income on non-essentials should go to charity. We think that that is a different way of viewing the motion, which is why we think that faced with the choice is an essential component to the motion. So again, not a huge point, but we do think it's helpful in crystallizing the debate. Let's move on to their argumentation that they provided. They firstly talk about action versus money. This is how they're kind of setting up the debate. They're essentially arguing that by giving to charity, this disincentivizes us to act. This was their kind of clinching point at the end of her speech. We don't think that this is the case, and we're actually going to be showing that in this speech. Now, if we move on to their first point, they talk about how monetary donations are actually limited. They also talk about how charities don't always work. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the alternative here, and it's kind of ironic because this also happened to be the semifinals debate, that motion there. So they're arguing this idea that charities don't always work. Essentially that not always the money is allocated well, sometimes the charities are dysfunctional. What is their alternative? Their alternative is you yourself go out and serve, right? So essentially what we end up with is a world in which a person could go to Mexico, build a house for the sake of charity, doing the action that they would have you do, and that gets torn down next year, so you go back a year later, it gets torn down again. It's essentially a waste, and it's a useless waste of time. Essentially, our argument here is that charities, on the other hand, provide the necessary structure and accountability to best help the poor. That's why we think money should be going to charity, right? You can join a charity, right? You can even work for a lot of nonprofits in New York City. That's great. But we think that charities, first and foremost, what do they tell you? We need money, right? Oftentimes, they don't tell you we need volunteers. Sometimes they say we need money, which is why Truth is raising money oftentimes for their partnership instead of going out and acting, right? This is why we do this, is because oftentimes charities actually need money. So we don't think that the argument is legitimate to be made that monetary donations are limited and giving money to charities is a bad idea. Secondly, we talk a little bit about, they talk about what does the non-essentials mean, and they argue that, well, you can just open your home up for other people, make your home a home for others. We think that this is taking the motion at its best, granted, but what about the motion at its worst? They're describing non-essentials with the best intent, right? What are some other non-essentials outside of just making your home nicer for others, right? What if it's something like buying an Xbox, right, that you would play by yourself in your room? That's a non-essential too. And we don't think that they've accurately represented what a non-essential is. We can take them at their best, and I'll do that in a second, but I just wanted to show you that's not always the case. Sometimes the non-essential that you're spending it on, instead of giving it to charity, not exactly the right option. Sure, I'll take your question.
Okay, so if you believe that giving to charity or being a sender is so important, shouldn't it be worked into your budget before you get to discretionary income? Shouldn't it not be just an afterthought?
Yes. We don't have a problem with that. I mean, a lot of budgets do have charity worked into it. My parents put 10% aside at the beginning of their month just to give it to charity, right? That's part of the budget, right? We're talking about extra, not like discretionary income, non-disposable income, right? We think that that can absolutely be a part of the budget. I would encourage that. I have no problem with that. Let's talk a little bit about, let's take them at their best again. So they're talking about like making a home. And essentially our argument is that this actually doesn't really disclude our side of the motion. right? We can also do this at the same time, right? You can both give to charity and make your home a home, right? So this is not an exclusive argument for their side of the debate. Finally, their final argument is this, that there's a disincentive to act on your own by giving to charity. Again, go back to my first point, we don't think that this is necessarily a bad thing. We think that giving money and action are equally important in the realm of nonprofits and serving the poor and helping the poor. We also think, however, that giving is an action, right? They're talking a lot about this action and that it can create a disincentive for you yourself to go out and serve. We think that giving is just as good. We think that the Torah is very explicit in the idea of giving as being an action, right? It's not something that you just like say, oh, like this is an easy thing for me to do. It might be easy, that doesn't make it bad. Finally, let's take a look at their last argument they talk about, which is the idea that we're creating a savior complex. I find this argument interesting because I think it's actually the other way around, right? If you go out to a third world country with your phone and are taking selfies of yourself, thinking about how much you're helping the poor and serving the community, maybe that's actually creating more of a savior complex in your head once you see the people that you're helping rather than giving money to the charity that's actually doing the good work. The charity that's actually going into these countries and actually doing the good work. Finally, let's take a look at our argumentation again, just revisiting that quickly. Now, we present to you three basic ideas. We firstly present the argument that what is discretionary spending, and we kind of get into this idea that, again, luxury is relative, right? This idea that non-essentials is kind of a gray area oftentimes. In one place, a car might be essential, in another place it might not be. We think that this is essential to the debate. We think it's important to look at the concept of non-essentials. More than that we have to look at the criteria of what actually helps the poor. And we think that, yes, capitalism is a great engine. We think it's a great long-term motivator. And we think that discretionary income going to something else that's not charity can actually be beneficial in the very, very long run in elevating people's standards of living, right? But you can't just do that alone. You have to have charity to go along with it because it's also charity, money going to the charity and them going into and actually knowing stuff about the place that they're going into, that we think that's most important. So who helps the poor the most? We think that the theological argument is charity. We think that the economics debate is there, and they've done a good job arguing that. We would also ask you to look to the theological argument that says Yahweh tells you to give. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Or most people, we'll go with the majority. All right, so I was just thinking back, listening to Kyle's speech now from the government side about this one beloved book that sits on my bookshelf. And if you've seen my bookshelf, you know that there are many books, so choosing one is kind of hard. So there's this one book, it's blue and it's old because these type of books should always be old, and it's called a dictionary. And so every now and then, I like going through the dictionary and like finding these cute little pictures. My favorite is this one little insect. It makes this cute little chirping sound. But last I checked, if I'm right, always means all the time. And so when it comes to the motion that we're considering right now, the discretionary funds are about always being used for charity and not a choice as the government side has been proposing. To go through a few other clarifications about arguments brought up by the government side, they were saying in response to the point of information earlier that the marginal difference about the percentage that people normally use for discretionary funds is unknown. Well, but even if we're thinking theoretically, the discretionary funds are so small, even if we don't actually know the numbers, the marginal difference that the government side is proposing to be added to the funds that they're already setting aside for charity is so marginal and insignificant that the difference that they're talking about is rather insignificant. Second, I'd like to point out that theological choices also encompass economic choices, so we need to consider how we can properly be allocating these needs. And yes, Christ does say that we need to give our money, but he also says give ourselves, and so that means more than just money. And the other point that I wanted to bring up in response to people and the way that they're using their they were responding to making your home a better place, and but people could also use it for bad means, and that's speaking a little too idealistically. Well, but if we think about it, the world that they're proposing is more idealistic because it's assuming that people aren't going to use this as a check mark to say, okay, I've done my good deed for the day because I don't just use a little bit of my discretionary funds plus another little bit of my income that I'm receiving, but I use all of my discretionary funds plus this other. And if we think about human nature and the way that people think about what they're receiving and their income, then it would be a very simple way and a way of encouraging people to think that this can be their good deed and then it's done and gone. And so when we're thinking about the weight and the burden that the government side is proposing to us today, we have to keep in mind that they are saying not just sometimes that we have a choice about how we use our discretionary funds for non-essentials, but in fact that you always use everything that you have in your discretionary funds for charity and not anything else. So reviewing the points that the opposition is proposing as an alternative, we want to remind us, the crowd and judges, that monetary donations are limited. We believe that it's important that we aren't just giving money to people because, yes, charities need money, but last I checked, they also depend on the people coming in to help where that money is going. But you disagree?
So people give very little in the status quo. So if it's true that people act and serve instead of give, shouldn't we see more service happening?
Well, I think that's just adding to our point that there's a problem on both sides, that we need to be giving, yes, but we also need to be serving just as much. And if we think as giving is sufficient, then I think that's a flawed understanding of what true compassion looks like and what it actually looks like to serve people, because it's not just about giving to money. If we think that charities primarily depend on the money coming in, then all we're left with is a building full of money. We need people who are actually there and not only serving at the charities, but also going around to their neighborhoods and making their place a good home to invite people in as well, and learning what it means to actually have active compassion as the opposition side is giving to you, instead of encouraging passive compassion that the government side is only able to offer. Our second point, again, is that eliminating non-essential spending discourages the act of compassion. So again, this is the problem with the government's position and what they're trying to persuade you of, is that when we're using our non-discretionary funds, then we're not allowing people to be more creative in the ways that they can outreach. Tom's is a good example of that. When we're only giving to the business, when the business is going off and doing their own thing, and it's great that we're providing the shoes for the kids, but it would be better if we're actually having a personal connection and maybe using those non-discretional, maybe using those funds to make it smaller, shorter, as my partner was saying, to maybe get a ticket and go actually see those people and have more of a personal connection in way that we're serving, instead of this artificial barrier that we're setting up because, well, I paid the money, and so that's sufficient. And again, our third point is that this encourages a passive culture, because if we think that encouraging people to use all of their non-discretionary funds is the way that they should be using it, then that encourages a mindset of checking off a box and being done. Then that encourages a passive culture, and we believe that is unacceptable. We believe in active compassion, where people are going out and not just giving money, because we do believe that giving to charities is important. There is a monetary weight that these charities are feeling. But in addition, before we have money, we need people. So to encourage that, we believe that people should not just be using all of their discretionary funds, as the motion says, but rather perhaps using some of it because it should be coming from the heart and not just, always, so, okay, this is a good deed. But instead, they should be focusing more on more creative ways in which they can be engaging and serving their community. And that is why I'm proud to stand with the opposition.
Is everybody ready? And Where's the timer? Your timing? Okay. You know, there was a big problem in my church back home in Alabama where we kept on talking about this whole, yeah, we need senders too. We have to have senders. We have to have people who are willing to give money. But no one from our church was actually willing to give up any of their summer or their extra money buying plane tickets in order to go out and make a difference in the world. So we didn't have anyone to send in the first place. We think that encouraging a world that just has senders is incredibly narrow-minded of the government team and also eliminates the possibility of having a world where active compassion is valued. We think that saying non-essentials should always come at the risk, or losing non-essentials should always happen when faced with a choice between that and charity, creates a culture of passive compassion as opposed to one that values true difference in the world. Through this speech, I want to ask three main questions. I want to summarize the round and what we've heard from so far and show you why clearly in this round there has been a misunderstanding of fundamental definitions by the government team, but furthermore, we have a world where I don't frankly want to live in. So the first point I want to look at is what is active compassion. So throughout the entire speech of Kyle, it was great, awesome to hear from you, but I don't think you once talked about active or passive compassion in the capacity that we were framing the round as. We want to engage with these topics because we think it's important that we actually have a world where we have active change. And when you just talk about the fact of having senders, you ignore the fact that goers have to exist in the first place. And what does that require? Spending your non-essential income on buying all the clothes and the travel funds necessary in order to go out to the places that other people can help you get there. We think that saying that in always, under any circumstance, you have to spend it on charity is wrongfully assuming the way that the world works and not allowing a person to actually get there in the first place. But furthermore, we have to understand that active compassion is when you are willing to actually make a difference in the world instead of having a culture of complacency. Before I move on to that point, I'll go ahead and take your POI.
So it seems like you're making a new argument here, the idea that non-essentials, spending money on non-essentials includes spending money on clothes. So it seems like you're arguing that clothes are not essential.
So I'm going to Israel this summer, and I just found out that I have to wear certain outfits that cover different parts of my body that I don't actually have that amount of money set aside for. So that's going to be my extra income spent on that. That's not an essential because I'm making a choice to go to Israel in the first place. So that doesn't make any sense about what we just heard. But that leads me to my second point. Why do we need non-essential spending? So let's just address that clearly. So first, throughout this round, we've sort of had this understanding of non-essentials that you guys have presented without defining it whatsoever. So it's been left to us, and it's gone back and forth all the whole round. So I'm just going to give you a definition of what are essentials. Essentials are when you have need it desperately to survive, things that you need to survive, things that your family needs, and I will agree that changes based on the family. But what do we have in mind there? We have a world where non-essential spending is always chosen to go away in favor of giving to charity. And we think that having a world that has that always making that case means that even in the possibility where non-essential spending could better help your community, could better allow you to open up your home, could better allow you to have a culture where you are willing to actually engage with ideas and are better equipped yourself to engage with the world and make a difference in the world, we think that that slowly gets ignored in favor of just giving to charity as a blank check. We think that saying always is very narrow-minded and not idealistic in the best way, because they also assume under this that people are going to, when they give, they're always going to give with the right heart. I'd rather someone not give money to a charity and then later be able to brag about it if that money then could have better be spent on non-essentials that would have better benefited their community or better benefited their ability to help others on their own, not without the charity. We think that that's very narrow-minded, and they've really missed the point that it is always. always. But this leads me to my third point. Why does government create a culture of complacency? What we've seen throughout this round is really a mind frame of saying that, okay, in the real world where it exists, like where I exist as an individual, I'm going to always, under any circumstance, when I have extra income, give it to charity. And I think that they really haven't taken on that burden as the government side. Instead, they've tried to say, well, it's a good thing because we need senders. But I think that goers are slowly going to deteriorate when you have senders all the time. You have to have people who give, who are willing to give, but also willing to go. And you can't have both of those if you're spending all of your non-essentials or all of your extra income on giving to charity as opposed to non-essentials. I'd like to end with a quote from Lewis when he said that we are what we believe we are. If we live in a world where we believe that we are helping and benefiting the society because we sinned and because we just give money whenever we have those non-essentials and we don't have to worry about better equipping ourselves to be actively compassionate and to not be passive in our world, in our own everyday life, we think that that is going to create people who believe that it's okay to be complacent. I don't believe that it's okay to be complacent, and I believe we have a responsibility to stand up for actively making a difference in the world, as opposed to saying that whenever you give to charity, then that is going to solve all the problems. Thank you.
Man, this is fun. I debated in speech and debate in high school, and Grayson Logue happened to be in my region. I saw him give a lot of speeches to close out debate rounds, and he always liked to go to one particular, I think it was a John Adams quote. Unfortunately, I don't remember the quote, but I know it had to do with facts or stubborn matters. I can't remember the rest of it, but that's enough. That's sufficient. The fact that I can't remember the quote is a stubborn matter. So the fact that I'd like to get into in this debate round, there's a few facts that I'd like to present in this final speech, just to clarify some things to show what the Gov side is and why we deserve to win this round. I'm going to structure this speech under the three questions that I presented in my first speech. That's first, what is discretionary? Second, what helps the poor? And third, who helps the poor the most? I'll be spending the most time on those first and third questions. So let's get first into what is discretionary. Both sides have agreed here that non-essentials can be a relative term. This is important to clarify because we don't want to have a debate where we're saying a car is a non-essential. Absolutely. We need to recognize that non-essentials is a relative term. I'm glad that we've agreed on this, that hasn't been a point of contention in this debate round, because that's an important point to establish in order to understand what people are able to give, when they're giving, and when they're providing for their needs, because needs can vary from person to person. The second point that I'd like to make here is that God's will is not discretionary. God's will is not discretionary. This is a point I made in my first speech. I don't think I made it quite so clearly as I had hoped to, but this is the idea of that theological discretion that I talked about. In other words, God has a will for our lives, and those things aren't discretionary. So if I'm spending my income on things that are God's will for my life, that's not my discretionary income. In terms of an economic definition, it might be, but we think that ignores the point of what the discretionary income question is asking. If it's God's will, it's not discretionary, and I think that's an important distinction to make. Let's move on to the second point. Go ahead.
So if it's God's will, but, his wisdom imparting wisdom about when you should do it, doesn't that imply that the discretionary funds are not always used? Did that make sense?
I didn't understand.
Okay. So you're explaining how God's will, or can you say that statement again about God's will?
God's will isn't discretionary.
Right, God's will is not discretionary. So that would mean that the discretionary funds are sometimes used for other means, but sometimes God gives us the will to use it for charities. And so that would mean that it's not always used because it is discretionary, and not always.
Okay, I see your point. And again, I think that's getting on the economic definition of what is discretionary income, and that's just a definition that we're disputing here. So when we're talking about discretionary income, we're saying if it's God's will, it shouldn't fall into that category because God's will is not discretionary. I'll be coming back to the spending all of your money on charity in the third point, so I'm going to leave that one for now. I'll come back to that though. The second point is what helps the poor. This is something that we've also, for the most part, agreed on in this debate round, and that's that there's things that require money that help the poor. And so, I mean, really everything that we do to help the poor in some way requires money, because just about everything we do in the modern world requires money to some extent. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to the third point, which is who helps the poor the most. And this is where we've had the most contention in this debate round. I'm going to start by telling a little story, and that is that I remember when I was young, probably around 7 or so, we went to this fair. It was the fall, we got a pumpkin, we got a bunch of straw, and we made a scarecrow. And we had it sitting on our front step for a long time. And I remember a few times when I was coming home as a young child, coming home and thinking that somebody was sitting on our front porch because it was frighteningly realistic. And then I discovered, no, it wasn't actually, it was just a scarecrow, it was a straw man. We think that some of the arguments that the opposition is making are just like that, frighteningly realistic. They're frighteningly realistic, but they're just not the point of this debate round. This is particularly on the active versus compassion point. What the opposition has said in this round is that they present the active side of compassion, we present the passive side of compassion. But what that ignores is that all of the things that are active that they're saying are not excluded under our side of the motion. You're still free to go. You're still free to serve. You can do all of those things under the government side of the motion. In addition, we contend that giving is an action. It's not something that's simply passive. That counts as an action as well. For some people, it may qualify as passive. Some people may just check off a box. A lot of people do that already. For those people who just check off a box, if we at least make it a moral obligation for them to give more of their money, at least they're giving more of their money when they check off the box and not less of it. But for the people who will do more than that, because there are people who do more than that, there are incredible people in this world who will do more than just check off a box and give money. Now we'll have the money for them to do more, to be capable of doing more that they need now, that they can do more work because they need the money to be able to do more work. So we think that active versus passive dichotomy that the opposition side has set up is just a false dichotomy. It simply doesn't exist in this debate round. And that's a crucial point, because this is the main point that the opposition has made in this round. So if we're able to show that that dichotomy is false, that essentially gives the round to the government. Go ahead.
Although we will concede that giving money is an act, would you not agree that it does set up a barrier between the type of activity that one is involved in, the extent to which they serve?
Sorry, I lost you again.
No, it's okay. So even though giving money is an act, sure, wouldn't you agree that it sets up a barrier in the extent to which someone is actually involved in service, because it is only giving money and not actually a human personal connection of service?
While it's possible that there is a barrier, I think that saying that by giving money you're setting up a barrier automatically and necessarily just simply isn't true. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case for, or it shouldn't at least be the case for most churchgoers. I don't think, well, I'm giving 10% to my church, so I also don't need to do more for my church as well. So I just don't think that exists. Last 2 points I'd like to make real quick in my time remaining. First is that spending encourages going. Spending encourages going. Yes, we need senders. Yes, we need goers. If there are more people equipping people to go, there's an incentive for people to go. We need to provide the framework for them to go. The second point is that in a POI earlier in the round, they asked, if it's so important, shouldn't it be worked into the budget? Why, yes. If we worked all of your discretionary spending into the budget, there would be no discretionary because we're giving it all to charity. And that's the entire point, is it not? So let's give it all to charity. As Lewis said, we are who we are. So let's give to charity and do the most good we can. Thanks.